Welcome, everybody. Scott Jones here, your host with Addiction Training Center and, of course, Addicted Communities Coalition. And I am speaking with Tim. Tim, I know I'm going to screw this up, so just smile when I say it. Grutzius.
Perfect. You couldn't have said it any better, Scott.
With a last name like Jones, I don't have to learn, very much. Nobody's ever mispronounced my name ever.
You wouldn't believe how my name's been massacred over the years.
Well, Tim, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you. I know that we've crossed paths, but not had a chance to speak. A year ago up in Illinois, you've been able to get online and take the intervention course, and we'll talk more about that. But why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your journey and who you are, Tim?
Okay, thanks, Scott. My name is Tim Grutzius, and I'm a retired lieutenant paramedic with the Alsip Fire Department, which is a south suburb of Illinois, Chicago. And my journey took me, and was really the significant part was in the first 3.5 years that I was on the department, I was exposed to several things that were traumatizing for me, which eventually led to me having a 16-year battle, ups and downs with undiagnosed PTSD. One involved the death of a 4-year-old girl where we got called for not breathing, and her mom, I was the doc on the ambulance, which would be the team leader, the guy that sits in the front passenger seat. Mom came up to me running on across the front lawn, dumped her in my arms and said, "Please save my baby." And when I looked in her eyes, and if you've ever heard the expression, the eyes are the windows to the soul, I looked in her eyes and all I saw were these lifeless blue eyes. I knew that she was gone, but we did work on her. We brought her back. We got a pulse, and she was she was sent from a local hospital to one that could serve her needs better, but 13 hours later, she ended up passing away. Second one was in March of 95, and I started on department in September of 94. In May of 97, we got called to the highway for a car fire. And what had happened once it was pieced out is a gentleman had his girlfriend's kids with him. He's at a bowling alley. He had too much to drink, got in a hit and run, took off from that, and he got on one of our major expressways going northbound in the southbound lanes. He ends up on the shoulder, and then right where there was a canal that runs underneath the bridge, there was a retaining wall. He struck that, and then the car burst into flames. We knew that he passed away immediately, but what got me was the children were 5 and 7 years old, and they were stacked one on top of another in between the console, obviously burned beyond recognition. And we got a little bit extra exposure out there because we had to stay there for a few hours until the medical examiner decided who was going to transport to the morgue for the autopsy. And the one thing that I remember significant about that is when I called in for pronouncement of death to our base hospital, the nurse said on the other end of the radio, "I'm very sorry that you had to witness that." And at that time, it did affect me profoundly that I talked to one of my fellow firefighters, and he got me hooked up with somebody from critical incident stress debriefing, and a gentleman came out to my house, spoke with me for about a couple of hours or so, and then that was it. Then it was life moves on, and that's how the fire service was, and we'll come back to that in a bit. The third one was the most significant one, which was in February 5th of 1998, where a friend of mine who was a colleague, a mentor, awesome fireman and paramedic, and I learned a lot from him in the short 3.5 years I knew him, ended up committing suicide on our watch. Me and a few other guys had to respond to that call. It was, he was our crewmate, and the way we kind of justified a reason at the time is that he knew that we would take care of him. Now, it was horrific how he ended up committing suicide, and I won't go into that because of it could possibly trigger readers. I'll tell you after we're done recording what it was, but it was horrible. And we got even more low because we got one critical incident stress debriefing that night. They pulled us off of duty. It helped a little bit, and then we were sent back to work 3 days later. And before we even went to his wake, we had to go for somebody that was a DOA. They've dead about 4 days. Somebody that had a cardiac arrest and expired. And then one of our regular patients we used to go to who was addicted to painkillers ended up committing suicide. So we had a fresh suicide we're dealing with. And then somebody, and we used to go for him several times, and he was a wonderful human being, but obviously the pain was a little bit too much for him. And after that, we were sent back to work. There was nothing else, no other debriefings, things like that. So I was in fire officer training class with one of my crewmates who was on the ambulance on our friend's suicide. And we had the opportunity to speak about it. So we had a little bit of cathartic experience where two of the instructors, and they were management courses, and it got into the topic of addiction, suicide, depression, things like that. And one of the instructors was also one of his lieutenants when he was on another department. And he said, would you guys want to come up and speak about this? So we did, and we were up there for about 45 minutes, and we're crying, and everybody, and we all went through the same cohort class together, and everybody was so supportive of what we had to go through. But then after that, life went on, and the mentality at that time was suck it up and move on. It wasn't said outright or verbally, but that's how it was. It's like you had to go back to the following shift, and then the shift after that. But what hurt us a lot was then you start hearing the rumor mill around the firehouse and things that, they were going to fire him. We know that. And there was a whole big story that went along with it. But that's what was the only thing that pushed him over the edge was that. That's the only thing that he held on to was that job, even though he had the pain he was suffering. And once we started hearing that, we ended up feeding into each other with a bad attitude, really held a very, very negative attitude towards our department. And at one point I was so bad that somebody said to me, you don't seem to be an approachable person. And that kind of hurt a little bit when that happened, but then we moved on. Then we'll just push forward. During those struggles with undiagnosed PTSD, the hallmark for me was the inability to effectively deal with conflict, where I would get, and it could have been just as simple as doing home improvement project, where if something didn't go my way or go right, and I'm kind of a perfectionist anyway, I would break something, smash something. My wife would just take the dog, go upstairs and say, Tim's being an asshole again. So we're just going to leave him. We're just going to leave him be to do what he's doing. But screaming matches with people, I'd be short tempered. And if somebody knew that they could push your buttons on whatever it was, they would do that. And I had somebody who was kind of a little bit of a nemesis with me. And then we both were promoted to lieutenants at different times. And then I got in this big screaming match with him in the meeting. And the chief even said, even I felt uncomfortable. And then I'm like, something's not right here for me, but just kept on going, pushing forward. And where things turned for me was an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper on our training board, which said Introduction to Firefighter Behavioral Health. And it was put on by a licensed clinical professional counselor who spent a lot of time interviewing and doing ride-alongs with different fire departments, primarily the Chicago Fire Department, but she also did suburban departments. And she connected with, in a class with Jeff Dill, who runs the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. And that's what gave her this spark. Hey, this is an untapped community that really needs help, the first responders, the firefighters. So I gave her a call. I wasn't going to go to that training because it was a little bit too far away from where I am, but I talked to her on the phone, told her a little bit on my story. And she said, you know what? You seem to have a lot of trauma. I'm also an adjunct faculty at a university, and I put on a workshop, a weekend workshop for human resources and psychology students, and it's called, firefighter. It was firefighter, not firefighter, but first responders, and something like trauma is what it was. And she said, "I'd like you to come and speak at that, and you'll get 15 minutes to talk about it." And she said, I said, I could talk for hours on this subject. She said, but they can only take in short segments, and I have 8 or 9 other first responders that are going to speak there as well. And one of the things I had to do was put together a lesson plan for her. And I had written for an English comp class a narrative about something that drastically changed your life for the better or for worse. And I wrote in detail about that night that my friend committed suicide. So I was going to just lead off that story. But as I'm doing this, I start living this unexamined life where I started going in this downward spiral, getting very emotional about this. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? Well, when the day that I went there to speak, I couldn't even get 2 words out of my mouth before I broke down crying in front of these students. And she said to me, it's a very long day. And one of the other things in our initial conversation, she said, we're starting this new group called Illinois Firefighter Peer Support. And I'd like you to put an application for that because I think you would be a good fit. So I signed up for it. And when I was walking out the door that day from that workshop, she said, it's going to be 3 long days in this training. And I said, compared to what I just went through, it's going to be a walk in a park. And I was wrong, because the second day in, she had offered her services to me. So I took her card, but Tim being Tim, all right, maybe I'll go talk to our counselor. It was during the second day of the training when she talked about PTSD, where I sat there and I'm like, I got a problem here. And I went and sat down in front of her and said, I'm going to take you up on your offer. I went through about 5 sessions, and it was cognitive behavior therapy. And then she said, you're a pretty independent thinker. So I moved on, and then just got involved with the peer support and doing the additional trainings, educational outreach, doing one-to-one peer support. And then I want to start my own, I was going to start my own business, because I'm also, along with firefighting, I became a personal trainer during that time, as well as I'm a Reiki master practitioner. So I was going to I'm putting together a business, and all the things you had to do, I was going to try to do federal trademark status. And then I just started going in this downward spiral again, because the pressure was just too much for me. And I ended up going back to counseling a second time, doing EMDR this time. And I said, I'm here just for a check-in. And it lasted 9.5 months. But eventually I had my breakthrough with everything. And the EMD started back when I was 5 years old, when I witnessed a big blowout argument between my parents. And it just created this freeze response for, from the age of 5 to the age of 50. And that, and then since then, I've been doing way better. Still, I could still have my moments, but, for the most part, I'm learning with emotions. And when I was on a podcast the other day, I was talking about emotional intelligence, and my emotional intelligence score was probably very, very low, because I could get set off real quick and couldn't manage my own emotions, as well as how I dealt with other people. So that's where I'm at right now.
Wow. That's quite a journey. Now, if you don't mind, I could just love to ask a few questions about, some of those things. Starting with the first and probably the most obvious, being in the fire service, and I guess any level of first responder, but we're speaking specifically about fire service now. It's not a job. It's a little more than that, isn't it? I mean, I think I want people to understand that you're drawn to do this work.
Yes, and actually, it was funny. I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago and got a degree in criminal justice. So originally, I wanted to be in law enforcement, but more specifically, because they had recruitment days, federal law enforcement. I had interviews with the DEA, Border Patrol, got fingerprinted for the U.S. Marshals, but back in 1986, there was a federal hiring freeze, so that didn't happen.
Right.
Well, it's getting close to the end of college, and I'm going to need a job. So got a job doing retail security, and eventually just kept on testing for different police departments, waiting for that call from the feds that didn't come. And eventually one thing led to another, where a friend of mine who was he was a school psychologist, had an FBI agent in his class for his master's program. And he said, why don't you come and talk to him? And this guy said, you know, you might think about going into the military, because that could give you a way into the federal service. And it didn't happen. So wanted to be police, but then when I went into service, I was stationed in Barstow, California, and I ended up taking an EMT course out there. And then when I came back, got out of service, got hired by private ambulance company into paramedic school, and then eventually I landed with ALSIP for 25 plus years.
Wow. Now, I guess I phrased it that way because listening to some of the stories you just told, I mean, even without all of the detail, it seems like most people, when they'd see something like that one time, would pack up their toys and go home. They wouldn't be going back. If you're working at a regular job, and let's say you're a teller at a bank and a bank gets robbed, it's quite common for the teller to quit working there because it's too traumatic. What is it that keeps you guys going back into the fray after this daily bombardment of both trauma and pain? What is it that keeps you going?
Well, I think for me, it's always, and as you could tell by my story, that I was drawn to public service
Right.
at an early age. And the one show that really impressed upon me was Emergency, back when that was on. And, Johnny Gage and Roy DeSoto. And then, so it's just, I don't know, it's just something noble about the profession, being able to help, do something to help your fellow man. What pushes you forward, I think a lot might be compartmentizing things, just shoving it and stuffing it into a box and not really dealing with it. As far as processing the traumas that you have. And, back in 1994, all the way to, my first 20 years of my career, there was no peer support.
Right.
Or we didn't have anything where our department was set up and said, hey, if somebody sees something traumatic, we're sending you to see a department psychologist. We didn't have that. Our department was very small. We only have 2 stations and just a little over 30 personnel. So resources, budgets and things like that, that's what pushes things like that aside. So, but I think the thing was compartmentizing it, but we're going to come into probably something a little bit more that you want to talk about, how we actually deal with it.
Yeah. All deference to Emergency, which I loved as a child too. I thought the answer to every medical issue was an IV with D5W lactated ringers, because that's what they would say in every episode. Kid falls off a bike, that's the thing. Has a heart attack, that's the thing. It's this.
Right.
But, I understand that, you're called to the public service and everything. And in this compartmentalizing, that was really your only coping mechanism. We're talking about years ago. Now, we're not talking about today, but years ago, people need to understand that there was no awareness of trauma, and PTSD was probably in the back of some psychiatrist's book. It was not out in the public. The therapy for a lot of people was, you do the job, you swallow it, you compartmentalize it, you go to a bar, you numb yourself a little bit. I'm not saying get drunk every day, but that's where you socialize and you get your energy, and you go back and you do it all over again. So there was absolutely really no paying attention to that kind of trauma that was going on, right?
Exactly. There's absolutely was not, because guy commits suicide, one critical incident stress debriefing, and then you were sent back on your way. We just weren't prepared to deal with something like that
Right.
to that magnitude. And so, when you have the chief that we had at the time, unbeknownst to us, he was battling cancer, brain cancer, things like that. So you had an assistant. Well,
Wow.
he was the deputy chief that had to step in to that role, and he's reeling. Everybody's reeling. We didn't know, so that we thought the best thing is to do what always has been done: just move forward and go on to the next call.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that forward movement was probably the only thing saving you guys at the time from really losing it. Was you knew you had to get up and do it the next day, because if you didn't do it, who was going to do it?
Exactly.
And that's tough. Now awareness started to change. Do you know that point when, not necessarily in your career, but as a whole in time, was there some things that you noticed saying, wow, things are changing? And when did that start to happen?
Well, for me personally, and for like the state of Illinois, it was when the forming of Illinois Firefighter Peer Support. I was in the first training class in April of 2014. So it was moving forward from there. And then they went to a state union convention. They spoke there. Who eventually became our executive director and clinical director. They spoke there. So the awareness started getting out, but it still took a long time. We're now over 200 strong throughout the state of Illinois. But things that I remember reading or watching TV. In fact, there was Steve Buscemi did a special for HBO, and he was interviewing, basically because he was a New York firefighter at one time.
Right.
And he went back. He started interviewing all, maybe former crewmates or his station and other firefighters. And I remember them talking in there how they started their own internal peer support for the FDNY. So I would like to think that probably somewhere around September 11th, and that was the biggest magnitude that we could ever get. That I would say somewhere around there is that maybe they started looking at things like that. I can't really exactly say that moment, but for Illinois, it was the start of Illinois Firefighter Peer Support.
I think it was. I think 9/11. Certainly, we have to look at that. Kind of brought it home to everyone about the dangers and the stress and the trauma and all of the things that both firefighter, police, EMTs, paramedics, what they all have to do. I mean, while somebody's sitting maybe in their home in Kansas who's nowhere near any of that stuff that's going on is watching this unfold on TV, they're watching these heroes go into the fray. And then the subsequent conversations afterwards about what they went through and the traumas and the loss. It's probably I don't want to say that there's ever a good reason for something like that to happen, but something good was born from that. I think it was a greater awareness. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Greater awareness for sure. I mean, that whole thing was traumatizing as a whole. And I think that was one of the greatest examples of vicarious trauma where, how many months did we have to watch them burning, smoldering towers in that pile? And it consumed our news media for months and maybe even up to a year.
Yeah.
And even though you weren't there, how many, that, and it's still year after year when they do specials on it, they keep showing those people jumping from the towers. So you have that, and you pile that on top of what you have going on in your everyday life. And this is all people of all walks of life. One of the things that I realize is that you're bringing a history with you into the public service. And it's not just us, but any walk of life. People may have been part of alcoholic families or abusive families. And now you come to you bring it into the fire service. Now, we did have a psychological exam, but it didn't go as much in depth into stuff like that.
Sure.
Personality tests and things like that. but it didn't go into that in depth. So now somebody is on the job and we go respond to a call for domestic abuse, and they live that for the better part of their existence. And now they're ready to jump down somebody's throat and choke them. And then you're like, the hell, what's going wrong with this guy that he's going off? But nobody would talk about things like that. You know, the kitchen table is a great wealth of knowledge when it comes to raunchy stuff and, hey, I need a guy. Does anybody have a plumber? This and that. So there was always a minimal type of peer support anyway. I remember asking when my wife and I first bought our house, asking guys at the firehouse, what can you expect to go through with stuff like that? So that was peer support at its minimal. But when it comes to talking about mental health or behavioral health issues, that's where people start getting a little bit nervous about talking about things like that. So it's just still going to be the greater awareness.
Yeah, I think we should take a moment and because we've been using the term peer support quite a few times. And if somebody's watching this who's maybe not in fire service or a first responder, might not understand that term. What would be a good layman's way of explaining what exactly is peer support? Its job to do and who they are.
Right. Well, peer support, what it is that the way we look at it in Illinois firefighter peer support, nobody knows another firefighter or paramedic or first responder like another one does. Somebody has already walked what I call that green mile in their journey where they had to go from moving from out of the shadows of the stigma of mental health associated with first responders and into the light and getting that help that they needed for themselves. So basically how it works is, and it doesn't always, it depends on what the peer wants, whoever's seeking help. Sometimes they want to sit down with you for coffee. Other times they just want a phone call. And now because of COVID, you're talking about, I spoke with Tom Howard a couple of weeks ago, and he said, now I can connect anybody. It doesn't need to be somebody that's within their area that, that peer is closest to. Now we could do it on Zoom if we had to. And
Right.
He has even made a connection with somebody like that. So, I'll just explain to you how the process works.
Yes,
for firefighter peer support. So we have a Facebook page, we have a website, we have a phone number, and these are all different ways that you can connect or seek help with. We'll just say the phone, they call on the toll-free number. It's not a manned phone line. It's something that I think it might be run through Grasshopper or something like that. And what happens is once somebody leaves a message, the people that are on intake will get probably an email or some notification on their phone, check this message. So then they do that and they'll call and they'll just screen somebody and we never use any names. It's just, where's the basic area you're at? And maybe you'll use their first name, and then you'll say, what is it that you're looking for? What's your issue? And it could be anything from financial, marital, PTSD, addiction issues, or they had trouble with a call. And then what Tom does, and I think that was Ryan Letary, what they do is that they put out a blast email to all members, and they say, you got this person, this is their age, this is where they're at, and they're looking to speak with somebody who might have similar circumstances. And when we first started peer support, it wasn't always like that. It would be who could ever respond, and then, hey, I'm willing to do this. But now they're trying to hone a little bit more. We all have, if you wanted to, you could put your biography on the website and people could glean that and say, hey, you know what, this person resonates with me. So I'll just give you an example. What happened one time, there was a department that had a child that drowned, and it was a dive team that had to make the recovery. Well, these guys were having problems. So the blast email went out. We're looking for people that are on dive teams or dive experience and want to talk to them. So sometimes they'll ask just for a general educational outreach or maybe a group setting. But if somebody wants to sit down with you as a peer, you'll get if you are closest to what this person's looking for, Tom or Ryan will contact you and say, all right, you got it. give that peer's information to them, and then you make the phone call, and then you take it from there. And it's really just going and sitting and listening to them. You might offer a little bit about your story, but the longer I've done this, you start getting that sixth sense about you that when you do that initial phone call before you meet with them, I think they might need a little bit more than what I can offer. And the first thing I learned about peer support was I had asked our clinical director, when do you know it's time to refer somebody? And she said, when you start becoming the counselor. Because really, the peer support, you might stick with them for a few phone calls, just a couple follow-up phone calls, unless you refer them to a therapist. If it's something that you could help them work through, like sometimes hey, I'm having trouble at work. There might be, and bullying is big in the fire service now. So you might have an issue with that. How do I help with people? Or how do I restore relationships? I've destroyed a lot of relationships. How do I do that? And then you just sit down and you speak with them. And originally we try to help them make a wellness plan. What is it that you want to accomplish? How do you want to you just help them make action steps to get to where they need. And maybe you follow up with them on one or two more phone calls, see how they're doing. And again, if they need to be referred, once you make that connection, then you're pretty much out of the picture as a peer. But really, it's sitting down, having a conversation. And as I said earlier, you have people asking, well, what can I expect to buy a house, or just life in general about anything.
Right.
We had that little bit of peer support. Now it's just taking it a step further, and now we're actually talking about what's bothering you, what's going on in your life.
Absolutely. And it's important that that it happens within the department, within the ranks, because there is a certain separation from outsiders and people who are on the inside. And it's not a snobby thing. It's not a thing where it's like we're better than everybody else and we're superheroes. It's really about, these are the men and women who have your back every day, and your relationship has to be different than it is with anybody else. Is that fair? So getting help from inside those ranks, those people that you're part of your brotherhood and sisterhood, is really important.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it is, because I know there's peer support groups for nurses, and it would be a little bit difficult. As a firefighter or paramedic, you're at the initial call for somebody's need for help, and then you deliver them to the hospital, and the nurses take over from there. And especially if they're on a floor of critical care, they're establishing a little bit closer relationship with somebody. And as a paramedic, I could understand maybe to a small degree, but not what they go through. So it would be hard to make that understanding or connection, the mindset, for lack of a better term.
So you mentioned peer support and addiction, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, Addiction Training Center and Addicted Communities Coalition. Karen and I have put together the training for firefighters and for peer support to help them to not only recognize signs of addiction or possible problems, but also how to communicate once something is discovered. You took the course. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Okay, and it's really awareness. I love the course. It was set out very, I won't say simplistic, but it was in easy to understand terms for somebody who's never been an interventionist. I had a little bit of an understanding just from the process of being a peer support person, but not to the degree that I needed it. I went through like neurolinguistic programming. Just over my lifetime, I've been exposed to those types of topics. But the idea of the most important thing, and what Joel keeps stressing in our, thin line support group meeting, is, you have to have a plan ahead of time for this person, whoever is that you're doing an intervention with, especially when it comes to where are you going to place them, and, insurance things. And unfortunately, those are things that are necessary, because you don't want to send somebody and then the door gets slammed on them. But I'll tell you what about that, how that program really hit home for me, and everything came together, and it was kind of like a final exam. I ended up, during the time that I was taking the course, somebody in our community here said, "Hey, did you ever see the movie Flight with Denzel Washington?" And I said, "No," didn't know what it was. So my wife and I, "Hey, Bill said, watch this." So we did. And I was like, "Oh my God, this is everything that Scott and Karen talked about in the program, the signs, and even as far as covering things up." And I'll tell you what, that was a big thing. We had all different, in the fire service, you have all different types of addictions, not only alcohol, drug, but you got gambling, sex addiction, and for me, it was anger addiction. I was addicted to anger. It
Yeah.
felt good sometimes to punch a wall, even though it didn't solve things long term, but
It was the adrenaline and everything else that you built up through that you were addicted to. Yes, of course.
That is correct. And we had issues. We had some of those types of issues where I work, as well as surrounding departments. And a lot of times it was just cover it up, just like the airline did for Denzel Washington.
Yeah.
Cover this up. Let's get you through this. And then eventually you hit your breaking point and you say no. And we did have a young firefighter that eventually sat down with a lieutenant and said, "Hey, I got a problem with drugs." And prior to that, he was involved in a lot of vehicle accidents. Could he have been under the influence at the time? We'll never know, but it kind of made sense once that happened. So the big thing about your program is not only, teaching how to be an interventionist, but a lot of it is that awareness of what it is that you have to notice those signs. We didn't notice the signs. We didn't know our guy was struggling with severe clinical depression or anything like that. He hit it very well. But once you get that awareness or what to look for, then it becomes a little bit, you're now eyes wide open instead of eyes wide shut.
Yeah, Tim, listen, there are times when somebody's going to get through and it's covered up, or at least it's glazed over just enough where people don't really notice. But the truth is, in most cases, when somebody's struggling from a mental health problem, whether it's anxiety, depression, PTSD, or any other problem, an addiction problem, again, you name some of the addictions, when it gets to that point of destruction, maybe they crash a vehicle on a call, or they don't show up when they're supposed to, and people's lives are at risk when that happens. When it gets to that point, there are generally a handful of people, 6, 7, 8, 9 people, who have seen the signs but did nothing about it. And maybe that's the old way. It's like, it's not my business, or I shouldn't get involved, or I don't want to get involved. Times have changed. If you see somebody who's struggling, we have a responsibility, especially in a first responder situation, to get involved and help them. Isn't that right?
That is correct. And I'm going to tell you what I've been doing lately to help me hone my peer support skills or even awareness of addiction is, since I've been down here, we do a lot of streaming of TV shows, and we've gone back to watching old shows like Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue.
Yeah.
And if you remember the show Rescue Me.
Yes.
With Dennis Leary. We're currently in that and NYPD Blue now. We finished the whole Hill Street Blue series. But I noticed myself, I was younger when The Hill was on. That was 1981.
Right.
But NYPD Blue and Rescue Me, I started watching them because of the training that I have now, the awareness, the education I've got. I'm watching those shows through different eyes. I'm watching them not just as somebody who's watching it for entertainment. I'm watching it as a peer. And there was none other than Tommy Gavin and his crew that went through the post 9/11 stuff that were, the classic textbook addiction, and also how people covered up. But then you take it to the point somebody eventually had to get hurt to have that happen. And there is no way we want that this day and age, to have people just, let's give them their space, let them be. because then you're going to end up with a tragedy you don't want.
Listen, community-wide and department-wide and country-wide, our awareness is changing. Certainly, we know that. Back in the old days, what used to be acceptable with the good old boys network, and it's not acceptable anymore. It's not acceptable just to compartmentalize and swallow and keep going until you can't. We're changing that. But there's still one struggle that I think that is really hard, and that's the individual. We know what's right to do, but sometimes we're just afraid of stepping up and approaching somebody, or we're afraid of being the guy to call someone, and we don't want to be somebody who turns somebody in. We feel like we need to protect them and cover for them. I still think that's a little bit of a struggle, and I don't think that's a first responder struggle. I think that's a human struggle. We want to protect, and we sometimes think by being silent or hiding things, we're protecting people, but we're really not.
No, because long term, it's hurting them, and then you're hurting yourself. And when you're talking in the first responder world, it's critical because you're going in as a team, and everybody needs to be functioning at their best. If maybe not mentally, but physically. But it's a mind, body, spirit thing. You have to be there and all present, because you're dealing with people's lives, especially as a paramedic, when you might have to give drugs or any type of advanced intervention, and you're not all there. And that's when mistakes can be made. And it's not just this. I mean, one of the things I think you keep hearing from time to time is they want to change how residents for doctors are going through and stuff, where they got to work these 36, all these light shifts. They're trying to push that to now you're only doing 10, 12-hour shifts, because why did they do it? It was a rite of passage. So that's how we do it. But that's when mistakes get made. And
right.
It is no longer acceptable. You have to step up and help somebody. And as you said, the individual, one of the most courageous acts you can do is step them, say, I ain't got this today. I need some help. It's not, even though some of the mentality might be, it's a sign of weakness to do that. It's a greatest show of courage to do that. And I remember when I first was going to go for therapy, I found my chief, who was a firefighter at the time when we went through that suicide, and he was on the hose line. I said, Chief, I'm going to go to counseling. I think I have PTSD. I want to deal with this. And I think it goes back from that suicide and everything like that. And I said, but I want you to let you know, because we were self-funded insurance, and it was just managed through Blue Cross. I said, when those EOBs start coming in, they're going to see psychotherapy or something like that on there, and I don't want them questioning what I'm doing. He says, they can't say an effing thing to you. Do what
Right.
you need to do to get better. So even back then, I had that in my mind. Oh, what are people going to think of me? And even so, I did have some resistance on my department. I think it's getting a lot better now. But I still push forward, and I deliver the message. And that's all. That's one of the things you can do. You have to just be present, because one thing I didn't talk about peer support is it's totally voluntary. You cannot force it on somebody. They have to want it. Like a chief can't come in and say, hey, Tim, you need to sit down with this guy and talk to him, and then come back and tell me what you
Right.
said. We treat it just as if we are therapists. It's all about confidentiality, because otherwise it's never going to work. If they fear that you're going to go back to their chief and tell them what's going on, you'll never get that breakthrough or get them started on the right road.
So there's been a lot of change in your time with the fire department and working in peer support, and of course, enjoying your partial retirement, because it seems like you're busier now than you probably were when you were working all the time. But there's a lot of change that's going on. If you had to pull out kind of a book and wish for what's going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years, where do you see that we still need to make some improvements? And it's not as an indictment against what they're doing right now, but changes change. And what would you like to see more of, or whatever, in the near future for fire?
For fire, well, yeah, I mean, we're already seeing the great strides now. The the International Association of Firefighters have the Center for Excellence. They also started a peer support training themselves for their members to go through. So and there was like the international magazine that you get quarterly. One of them had it, and I think I still have it somewhere. It talked about PTSD and coming out of the shadows, and to have an international organization step forward and, let's bring that better awareness to the members, because who's ever a member gets that magazine. So you're reaching a lot more people. But I still think there may be a little bit of resistance. And I remember when I went to that workshop, that's where I met our first executive director, Matt Olson, and we just started talking. We were both in the fire service about the same time, and he said, "Tim, we are the 20-year guys, and it's our job to, when we do this peer support, that we put it together that the rookies that are coming on, we want them to feel comfortable with this enough to where conversations at the kitchen table don't always have to be about just fun things or dark humor or whatever else in the world. It could also be about stuff like that." He said, because we want them, when they're the 20-year guys, that they're really leading the charge on peer support. So that would be something that I would still want to see move forward. And again, when I started in 2014, there were only initial 30 of us that were trained. We're over 200 now. We've had 2 symposiums, and that's a big thing.
Yeah.
To have that. And now Tom had started another branch or armed forces, Illinois Law Enforcement Peer Support. They haven't gone through their initial training yet because of COVID issues, but eventually they will. And then his goal long term is to have them run their own organization and then make it a statewide organization. But seeing at these couple symposiums that we did have, and he is planning a third one. It just depends on when with the timing. But we also had law enforcement involved in there, and chaplains. That's a big thing. We didn't have one for our department. And that's important. The spiritual aspect doesn't have to be any organized religion, but somebody there that could offer spiritual guidance as well.
Absolutely. It sounds like one of the key things that you were speaking about when you first were answering the question was that it's almost like we got to destigmatize these issues. Mm-hmm. It should be open conversation. It should be, I'm a little disturbed by what we saw today. I'm feeling off about something. I mean, to get to that point where we're healthy enough as individuals and certainly first responders to sit around that table, the kitchen table, and instead of just talking about who won the Super Bowl, to talk about what they saw last week or earlier in the day, and to kind of check in with each other and see how you're all feeling and make sure everybody's okay. And if somebody's not okay, to be able to point them in a direction where they can be okay. Is that kind of what you're talking about, is really just to make it all normalized?
Yes, exactly. That it's not abnormal to react strongly to traumatic situations, because we know when we take that oath, we're going to see bad things, but we probably weren't prepared to the degree that it's going to affect us. The good thing and a really great thing is, since the evolution since 2014 that I've seen, peer support, the concept of peer support is being put into the curriculums in any fire service class that you take through the Illinois Fire Service Institute and maybe the Illinois Fire Chiefs Association. They put that in there. In fact, I spoke at an academy at a local community college where my friend who's on the ambulance now runs that program, the EMS and fire program, and he had me come out and speak several times. And I kind of had a little bit of a redemption from, when my friend killed himself, carried that survivor's guilt for a long time. What could I have done differently? Well, a couple of years, the year that I retired, 2019, I was going to come and speak at the fire academy again about not only peer support, but firefighter cancer awareness stuff too. And my friend called me and he said, "Hey, she's going to be in a class," and that she happened to be the daughter of our friend that killed himself, and she was only 5 years old at the time that he killed himself. So I said, boy, I'm gonna have to change the way I talk about this thing, because we had a little short training video when several years ago they took a bunch of us and we got to sit 30 minutes in front of a camera and tell our story. Then they just edit it and put it for a training video on our website.
Sure.
And we got to get 10 minutes segmented of that. And I ended up putting that in a YouTube video. And I always showed that to the fire academy classes. So it kind of gives you, this is my background and this is where I'm at now. And I said, how about if we let's pull her in the office. And we did. And when she first saw me, she just gave me the biggest head. Oh, I can't believe you're here and everything. And then I said, this is why I'm here. I understand that you know everything that happened to your father. Because originally when it happened, they just told the kids that he died in an auto accident. But she was eventually told the whole story. And I said, are you okay? Are you comfortable with me talking about it? And she did. She said, go ahead, tell what you have to tell. I never used names, but I showed it. And she sat there. She was very poised, hugged me afterwards. And I ended up, a couple months later, a week before I retired, I went to her graduation. So that was my redemption for it kind of closed the book on that story, that chapter of my life with him, that I was able to be there. And he'd be so proud of her today. In fact, this year, if all goes well, she's going to be getting married.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Listen, Tim, I really appreciate your time. And I just want to remind everyone who's listening out there, any first responder that you happen to notice, whether it's certainly the most famous, the military service and their responses, the fire, police, EMT, doctors, nurses, paramedics, the list goes on. Thank them for their service, because in this last year, Tim, I don't have to tell you, we've gone through everything from political unrest to racial tensions and exposure of inequalities to people having accelerated stress level, record unemployment, people losing their homes, and of course, COVID on top of all of that. And no matter with everything going on, you
froze up there,
men like you still had to strap on and go out there and do your job. And we appreciate it. And we thank you for that.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And I'll just leave one last thing. That
Please.
When you're talking about just mental health in general, you can notice on the commercials, like for Talkspace or whatever they have, you got Michael Phelps out there. You got Demi Lovato that are stepping forward. Lady Gaga even has put together something that is pushing towards mental health, mental well-being. It's okay not to be okay. But when you have people like that, of that magnitude, that they're known internationally, that's a great stride and a big step to step forward. And while we're working on the first responder end, they're helping let the general public at large from all walks of life know it's okay not to be okay, but this is what you can do to get better.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope for each year and in each day that passes, we learn more and help each other more. And Tim, I appreciate your time, my friend.
Thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate it as well.
We'll talk soon. You take care. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And if you want more information, the information's on the screen. You can take a look at the Illinois peer support websites. You can check us out right here at Addiction Training Center and Addicted Community Coalition. But for now, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank my guest, Tim Grutzius. Did I do it right?
Absolutely.
Good. Grutzius. And that was a miracle. I didn't think I was going to get that. Tim, you take care.
You too as well, Scott.